Thank you, Jessica. Welcome, everybody. I'm super excited to introduce this session and the presenters here, which I'll do so in a couple of seconds. Not only a great thank you to them for being on this webinar today and providing this content, but they were instrumental in helping ACIL develop the industry standard terms and conditions that we have on our website, which I'll share with you later on, as well as a few other contract documents, language documents that we also have available to you on the website too. So again, super thank you. Let me introduce our presenters. First of all, we have Mr. Tom Bundle, Senior Vice President and Counsel for Atlantic Testing, a Fenner Group company. He leads contract negotiation, drafting, and risk management for a wide range of agreements, including master service agreements, project-specific contracts, and subcontractor agreements. So, Tom, thank you for you being here today. We also are grateful for Jennifer Eggers. She is the corporate counsel at PACE. Jen joined PACE in December 2023. Prior to working at PACE, Jen was a litigator focusing on her practice on defending companies involved in mass accidents and incidents, including derailments. She was also in-house counsel for a railroad and IT company. So thank you both. I will now hand it over to Tom to get things started. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you all that can attend today. I know it's 1 p.m. on the East Coast and it's after lunch, so I'm hoping that it doesn't put everyone to sleep talking about contracts today. But we're going to give it a go. Our main goal today is to talk about five contract clauses that can sometimes present problems when you're reviewing, negotiating, and having issues except when you're dealing with entering a contract with a client. And before we get into those five, there's a couple key concepts I think we should all just keep in the back of our mind when we're generally reviewing and negotiating contracts. I think first of all, just remember that not all contracts are created equal, and I mean equal in the sense that the contracts usually starts out being drafted one-sided in favor of one of the parties. So you got to keep that in mind. There's always there's always risks associated with. I'm getting some feedback. Could somebody turn their mic off? Thanks. Just remember that there's always risks associated, and that's why it's important to review every contract clause carefully. The goal is to make sure that a contract is fair, reasonable, enforceable, insurable for both parties. So with that, it's very important to review all the terms carefully to identify any associated risks with a particular scope of service and type of project. And that includes reviewing, if you're not working directly for an owner, reviewing the prime agreement terms that may flow down. Many clients, they want those obligations to flow down to their subcontractors, and they want those same duties and obligations that they've assumed with their client to flow down to you. So it's important to, if you haven't seen your prime agreement terms, especially for a large complicated project, you want to request those on the front end and make sure you understand them before entering into a contract with your client. So, with all that said, it's very important to understand, the key concepts of a contract so that you can negotiate any sticking points. And then, as Richard alluded to, using an industry standard agreement can really help balance risk allocation. And, at the end, Richard's going to provide some links to the ACIL master agreement template that, we've developed to hopefully strike a fair balance with contract terms. So the five contract clauses that we wanted to talk about today are standard of care, indemnity, consequential damages, limitations of liability, and of course, all important, we all want to get paid payment terms. In terms of standard of care, being in the laboratory, professional technical services businesses, a professional standard of care really is appropriate. And that means that, the standard is really an ordinary level of skill and care, specific to that profession, location of the services, and circumstances of a particular project or service. So I think what the important point to really remember is avoid agreeing to a heightened standard of care that may be presented in a contract. Words like highest and best standard, those are red flags to look out for in reviewing a standard of care clause. And those also relate to other types of clauses that pertain to warranties and guarantees, because that really heightens your standard that you're agreeing to. Similarly, liquidated damages and delay clauses that often show up in contractor type building contractor agreements. Those can present problems and heighten your standard of care and really go beyond what your obligations are in terms of providing a limited service. Laboratory services, professional services typically have a limited scope, and the fees are limited, and compared to the overall size of the project are usually a small piece. So it's important to use an appropriate standard that it's not opening yourself up to a much larger obligation.
And then one thing that we look at is whether or not we're going to be on site, because sometimes there'll be all kinds of language in suggested agreements that deal with when you're on site, and oftentimes we are not on site. And I don't know if that's true for all of you, but most of the time PACE is not on site, except for maybe picking up samples. So that's something I think when you're talking about standard of care is looking at and making sure that you recognize whether you're on site or not and eliminate those things that are not for on-site services.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, John. And that goes along with providing a clear scope of services that outlines that and to make that clear in those expectations. So perfect interlude there. Thank you. So in terms of what you might see, and this example here is potentially a little bit exaggerated, but a clause that says that the company will at all times employ its best efforts and perform services in a workmanlike manner consistent with the highest level of industry attention, skill, recognized worldwide for the type of work ordered by the client. I mean, that's way too broad. It sets a standard that's unachievable in many regards. So better options are to again limit to an ordinary care that's exercised for similar circumstances, by reputable members of the profession. And here's a couple examples, and they're similar, but they're worded a little bit different. And the second example actually expands and kind of limits the geographic scope and range of where that expertise might be found. So again, just avoid that highest and best effort. Any other comments there, John?
No, I mean, I agree. Yeah. And they do try to put that in there, the highest level, the best possible skill, right? As opposed to just kind of the ordinary skill. So we do try to change that back.
Yeah, they're trying to get you to agree to perfection, which again is not reasonable. Okay, indemnity. This is really this one can be tough because clients will often try to stand firm on their indemnity clauses. And I guess just to define indemnity, it's a contractual obligation of one party to compensate the loss incurred by another party. So I think what's really, really important with indemnity is that you really need to balance that risk allocation, avoiding overly broad obligations, limit the scope to what you can control, and certainly try to avoid unlimited, or not try, but avoid unlimited indemnity obligations. If at all possible, make it reciprocal, where the client is also providing some level of indemnification for their own actions. And something that I really preach is beware of the word defend in an indemnity clause. That implies an agreeing to an upfront defense obligation. And in the context of professional services where you may be insured under professional liability coverage, that's often an exclusion and uninsurable to agree to an upfront defense. It's on the back end, and the whole point of professional liability is to provide indemnification after a determination of fault. And there's coverage for reimbursement of attorney fees and defense costs for your client after that determination, but those types of policies do not cover an upfront cost, and that could create an out-of-pocket obligation if you agree to this in a contract, and it's a professional liability issue.
Right. We try to say that we will indemnify for our negligence to the extent that we're negligent, and that you indemnify us to the extent that you're negligent. So it has that kind of balance, which I think is really important, is that both sides indemnify for their own negligence to the extent that they are negligent.
Yep. So again, here's something you might see in the wild where it's really one-sided. The client is not agreeing to any type of obligation to indemnify you, and it's really a broad obligation being agreed to. So a better alternative in terms of negotiating tips are to again, we've covered some of this, but and Jen just said it perfectly. Try to limit your obligation to your own negligence, your own intentional misconduct, rather than unlimited obligations. And push back on those broad, unlimited risk matters that are outside your control. And again, asking for that mutual indemnification to ensure fair risk sharing is important. And we've provided, and this is actually the example that we've provided in the model ACIL documents, where there's a 2-paragraph mutual indemnity, really trying to balance that risk allocation. And this language is available in those documents that Richard will share later. Consequential damages is another hot topic. I think consequential damages are indirect or special damages. Those could include lost profits, lost revenues, loss of use, reputation, etc. Those types of losses can sometimes are hard to calculate at the beginning of a project when you're potentially evaluating the risks. And they can be much larger than a direct cause of a damage, or that might result from a breach or some sort of incident on site or even in the labs. So
this is like a no-go for PACE. We won't agree to consequential damages. We will agree, and then they also want to carve out things like indemnity and all that. We'll carve out willful and wanton reckless conduct, because of course you can't really indemnify or agree to waive that anyway. But other than that, consequential damages is something that that's what really raises your cost, right? Your direct damages are like resampling for what we do anyway. But consequential damages can be crazy. That's what you do not want to allow an agreement that you will provide for consequential damages. It has to be excluded. At least that's kind of our position.
No, I agree with that 100%. And I think it is because what you just said, they're so disproportionate to the risk of the scope and fee that a laboratory offers. Our best practice, and we'll show an example here in a minute, is really to push forward and include a waiver clause in the contract, and often try to make that mutual. But again, here's another wild example where they want everything under the kitchen sink in terms of special damages, and be responsible for any and all claims brought by third parties. So it's just not reasonable, and it's really something to push back on. Again, in terms of negotiating tips, just it increases the risk in in proportionate way. Try to limit direct damages only, and then suggest a mutual waiver. And this is an example, and I think this is an example actually out of the ACIL standard terms that we use, and which
this is what we use too, and we really, like I said, we really do not agree to consequential damages. I mean, and then you've got to check your flow downs, because your flow downs may completely get rid of consequential damages in your protection here, unless your customer is willing to limit the flow down provisions to only consequentials. That's where we're running into big problems, is with flow downs, because they want you to accept the flow downs from their agreements, which means that they may or may not have negotiated a good deal limiting consequential damages. And if they haven't, and then they want you to accept their flow downs, and then you accept consequential damages, it can be a big problem. That's where you really run into risk, right? I mean, huge risk, like bet the company kind of risk with consequential damages.
Yeah, and that's exactly when I started out, Jen, is, that first slide was, to make sure if the client hasn't provided those flow downs, you really need to request them and to see what's contained. And this is one of the main reasons right here.
Yep. And we are starting to, in our contracts, require, not where the customer will say, well, you can request flow downs. Mm-hmm. We are starting to say in our contracts that we require flow downs. If you don't provide the flow downs, they don't apply. Because otherwise, it ends up coming to our project managers and no one asks for them, and then you end up subject to flow downs that you didn't even know existed, or that you haven't had a chance to review. So we are really starting to require in our contracts that it's an affirmative duty from our customers to provide us with the flow downs, or they don't apply to us.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach and very good strategy. Okay, the next clause, limitations of liability. Now this is more not really a contract killer, as the lead slide title implied, but this is actually a protection to add to a contract, and to push for. This really, the heart of this goes back to avoiding that disproportionate level of risk, and not accepting unlimited levels of risk. As I mentioned earlier, laboratories services, the scopes are typically limited in nature in terms of a very small subset of service that is typically part of a much larger, broader scope that your client might have. And those fees for the overall project may be much higher, disproportionate to what the lab fees are for a set of samples, for example. So really, in terms of limiting liability, your risk should be proportionate to the fees that you're offering.
Right. We try to limit it to the value of the purchase order, or we add something, sometimes the value of the contract for a year or something like that, depending on how big the contract is. This is probably our hardest area. Most people will agree to limit consequentials unless there's flow downs, but this is probably the place where we run into the most difficulty in getting our customers to agree to a reasonable limitation of liability based on what we do, right? I mean, you've got a $2,000 test, and they want you to be liable for, $1 million or $5 million or something like that, and it's just not reasonable. So, but it's hard. This is a hard one, I think.
I agree. It's not, you can see it from both sides for sure, but again, it's something that I think in every contract we try to incorporate to the extent that's reasonable. And in that sense, Jen, I think another approach is to limit it to a dollar, set dollar amount. You mentioned the number of samples you do for a certain time period, but even limiting to 50,000 or 100,000, depending on the size of the project, in terms of a cap on a liability, is much better than the full amount of your insurance policy, for example.
Right. And that's one thing that we will not do. A lot of times our customers will come back and say, well, we want this to be limited, or we want your limitation of liability to be tied to your insurance. And we just won't do that. I mean, our insurance is too high to agree to that, because then essentially there is no limitation of liability, right? So
Exactly.
that is one thing that our CEO has said from the day that I started, is we will not tie our limitation of liability to our insurance. It has to be tied to something related to the value of the contract, whether it's the value of the purchase order or the value of what we do for a year or something like that, but not the value of our insurance, because again, then that's really no limit at all for the most part.
I agree, and I think sparingly on occasion I will negotiate to limit to the proceeds of insurance, recovered, in terms of, so that's not your full policy amount. So there is in some contexts there's a middle ground there that, if it's an important project that you can, and the risks are low, you could work with. But I agree with you. I do not agree to the full policy limit. It's not reasonable for all the reasons you mentioned. Yeah, so other things we've kind of talked about, some of these other items in terms of limiting your risk to, your actual fault and actions with things that are within your control. And I think it's very important to provide a disclaimer of on third-party reliance on your reports and work product. You're really providing that information and data for your client, and if they're, if that goes down the chain and it's being relied upon by others and maybe out of context, we shouldn't be responsible for that, and that should be, fully disclaimed in the contract terms. There's a couple negotiation tips. I think these are also highlighted in some of the documents Richard can share later. So I don't necessarily need to read all of these, but it gives you some ideas in terms of, how to respond in terms of not accepting unlimited liability, and why it's important that you limit liability to direct damages and not consequential damages. I think there are, in terms of having some predictability and risk management on both sides, is a good conversation to have with the client. And I found that most clients, will at least be receptive to listening to that argument and explanation. And in terms of, again, when a client comes around and said they want no cap on damages, that's the conversation to have about, the limited scope and our limited fee, and that's not commercially reasonable to, have an unlimited liability for things that are out of our control.
Right. And the hardest thing here, I think, is again the flow downs, because they negotiate, and this is what we've been trying to push back on. Well, it's not our problem that you didn't negotiate a good contract with your customer. So then you want to flow down that risk to us, and that's just not acceptable. We still want a limitation on our liability, even if you didn't negotiate a good deal with your customer. So, but that's a hard thing to do, because they want you to accept the flow downs and the risk that they're assuming. They want you to assume, and we're pushing back pretty hard on that with our customers.
Yeah, and again, I think it goes back particularly for those consequential damages. That could be, astronomical. So again, this is the example ACIL model limitation that we have, and it goes to some of the points Jen pointed out in terms of limiting to the fees paid by the client for services, or to the sample delivery group. And it really limits, again, this incorporates that waiver of consequential damages right into the limitation paragraph itself. and requires that the company or the customer will provide indemnification for their own actions as well. So again, another resource that's available in the ACIL guidance documents. Payment terms. They might existed sometimes. I think the most important thing here to get across to clients is the terms really should be fair and reasonable. And at least in my world, and Jen, you can comment also, I see a lot of pay when paid terms. We work for a lot of clients that use those, and usually they'll pay within 10 days, or sometimes even they'll pay within 30 days of when they get paid by the client. But there's no guarantee when they're going to get paid by their client.
Yep. We've just basically said no pay when paid, certainly no paid if paid, yes. But also pay when paid. We just don't do it anymore, and we really are pushing for 30-day terms. We'll agree to 60, maybe 90, depending on the circumstances. But yeah, the pay if paid and pay when paid are just. I just don't think that's reasonable in this day and age, right? I think that's just something that we have to just tell our customers no.
Yeah, and pay if paid is certainly, that's the easier one to argue, since it's they're not even enforceable in a lot of states. And I think that goes along with the contract terms that kind of sneak condition precedent language into their payment terms. It essentially turns it into a pay if paid scenario. So we pushed back hard on those. And with the pay when paid, we'll try to put a pay when paid, or if the client sticks firm with it, pay when paid, or within 60 days, which is ever sooner, or whatever's reasonable for the particular client.
Yeah, not to exceed, pay when paid, not to exceed 60 days or something like that.
So that's one strategy to try to to temper.
And I like your last sentence here. Make clear that the non-payment forfeits the right to use the reports or work product. That's one of the things that we also are trying to do, is say, if you don't pay us, we're not going to send you the reports, or you don't get to use the reports. They're no longer valid, which helps, I think, if for whatever reason you're not getting paid and you need to kind of have a stick to say, well, you can't use our information then if you're not paying us.
Yes, and I've used that in collection efforts, and even kind of gone up the chain to the owner to put some pressure on if our client's not paying, that telling them that they we can't stand behind these, and you can't use these results for whatever reason, for project closeout or code compliance or whatever regulatory compliance you need. And here's the contract language that that was agreed to. So that sometimes helps. Sometimes helps with the collection efforts as well. So that was really the 5 main terms we wanted to talk about. Obviously, there's many more contract clauses to worry about in life, but we thought we'd hit these hot topics today. I don't know, John, any more thing you wanted to add on any of these that we talked about before we conclude?
No, I don't think so. If you guys have questions, we're happy to talk. But we're all kind of in the same boat, and I think the better off, the more that we push for these same terms overall as an industry, the more likely we are to get them, right? If our customers understand that this is kind of what is the industry standard, I think the better off we are. So that's what we're trying to do, is come up with these industry standards that make it harder for our customers to come back and say, well, nobody else agrees to this. Or everyone else agrees to, doesn't want to exclude consequential damages, or doesn't want 60-day or 30-day payment terms or whatever. So I really think that the firmer we all are on these terms, the better off we all are in getting what we need.
Perfect. Yep.
Great. Thank you both. Before we close out here, if anyone's got any questions, feel free to raise your hand. There's a little button that should say raise hand, and I'll come to you, or put a question in the chat, or if I'll keep an eye here if somebody unmutes. I'll see if they want to say something, if they're on the phone or something and want to say something. Anybody got any questions for Tom or Jen? I don't see anybody raising their hand or anything coming in here. I think it was extremely thorough. Um, First of all, just adding on to what Jen said there, these documents were part of a significant volunteer effort, and Jen and Tom were a huge part of this. And the whole goal was to not be unreasonable, but to provide fair contract language for the industry, right? And the links that I shared in chat will take you to all of these documents, including the negotiation or negotiating tips. So that is an excellent document to look at the clauses that have been presented here, amongst others that haven't, and look at what other contract language could be inserted in place, and how can you, what are some of the arguments around negotiating that out. So as Jen also stated, the more our members and more the industry use these fair contracts, then maybe we've got a more chance of greater adoption and making these more of the norm. I will tell you, on the links that we provided on the website, the documents are available not only in a PDF format, but in a Word format. So you can actually cut and paste, if necessary, onto some of your standard contracts. So, and again, you can refer to these when you're negotiating to say, this is industry, this is best practice, industry best practice. And that is why your trade association here, ACIL, put these together. So
we've been using that. We've been saying now that this is out there that, well, this is what ACIL does. This is the industry standard. So when people push back, some of our customers, and say, oh, well, nobody makes us do that, we say, well, actually, this is this industry standard. So the more we use it, the better off we all are, I think.
Totally agree. Totally agree. So I don't see any other questions in here. Again, as Jessica referenced, this will be recorded. It will not only be, it'll be linked on our website, also into our YouTube channel with a copy of the slides. Tom and Jen, cannot thank you enough for all the work you've done here and being on here today for this. It was an incredible value, and I think it'll be used over and over again, not only for the folks that are on the call today, but others that missed it that want to come back later to see it again. So thank you to you. And if you have not registered, everybody, for the annual meeting in November, this is just a taste of some of the education you can get at that session. So in November in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico is our annual meeting. All the information's on the website, registration, and we look forward to seeing everybody. So again, Tom and Jen, thank you. Thank you, everybody else. Have a great rest of the day.
Okay, have a good one.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.